just saying, Charles, it would be a good It shuts the phone off.
Actually, I'm tell you all about it.
No notifications.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I don't usually use a microphone, so can you hear me in the back if I speak like this? Okay.
Good try.
I tried. If in the event you can't hear me or wish me to repeat what I just said, just wave your hand. My name's AJ. I see many friends in this audience. Thank you for coming. You didn't have to break up your Monday afternoon just to see me drone on about a book. I think some of you might have been here for the book sandwich in I did 6 years ago on the book called Gotham, which was actually a bigger book than this one. It's a very exciting history book. So that I was asked back, I guess, is an honor and a privilege, so thank you, Alexis. So today's book sandwich in is about the ministry for the future. I'm going to try to show all my slides in the 58 minutes we have left and even offer an opportunity to talk about the book beyond my slides. We'll get started. This is the agenda. Obviously, The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson was published in 2020, so about 5 years ago. We'll talk a bit about Robinson and a bit about the book, why I read it, some themes and highlights, and then why you should read it. And hopefully by the end of this, I will have convinced you that this is among one of the best works of fiction that you may ever read. It's a tall order. It is certainly one of the best works of fiction I have ever read. To our agenda. Who is Kim Stanley Robinson? I would argue that Kim Stanley Robinson is one of the foremost authors of science fiction in the United States today, and perhaps globally. He's well known globally. He was originally from Illinois, grew up in Southern California, spent most of his life living in California. He was educated at UCSD and Boston University in, UC Santa Cruz. He's written 21 different novels so far, and he continues to write novels, numerous novellas and short stories, and he's won multiple awards for science fiction writing. Obviously, if you don't know, Hugo and Nebula are among the most prestigious awards for science fiction writing, as well as the Locust. In an interview that I read, or maybe listened to, when he talked about writing The Ministry for the Future, he wanted to write a novel that created a plausible future history, and even by his own admission, a best case scenario, but one that people could believe in. In the past few years, Robinson has become one of the biggest advocates for near-term or for people to wake up to the climate change that we are living through and to start doing something about it. And in fact, the Ministry for the Future is like his idea of one way humans can protect our Earth and make it through what he considers to be an incipient or perhaps already unfolding mass extinction event. And by extinction, he means us. So a little bit about the Ministry for the Future as a book. Like I said, it's published in 2020, 563 pages, 106 chapters. I got my own copy. I first read a copy, this edition, through the OWL system, a book that was loaned to me via the Honeyway Library. So thank you, the folks at Richmond, who helped them publish or purchase that book. But it was so good, I bought my own copy right away and have read it multiple times since, including over the past week when I was preparing for this talk. What is the Ministry for the Future? It's an extended story about how our world might survive or might transition in the face of existential climate crisis. It is a very near-term future sci-fi. Most sci-fi is written sometimes hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of years in the future, and everybody looks like us, talks like us, and stuff like that. Robinson wrote this book to talk about the decades of what he has called the Great Turn. In other words, the final realization that we better do something, or we're going to end up like the dinosaurs. He has many themes in the book, which I found most interesting. They revolve around the social economy, geoengineering, eco-defense or eco-terrorism, depending on your point of view. Trauma and recovery from trauma was a very significant element of the book. Green technology and adaptation, using technology, as well as conservation and rewilding. So before I get too much further, here's my survey. Who's read the book all the way to the end so far? Okay, so very few of you. Who is currently reading the book? Okay, a few of you. I know Liz, she told me she's got 30 pages to go, so I'll try not to spoil the ending. Okay, for the rest of you, I'll try to temper the talk so that I don't spoil all the fun, because it's really worth the read to delve into any of these particular themes. And I hope that now that you're seeing that some of these themes aren't like spaceships flying and aliens encountered and stuff like that, it's not a normal sci-fi in that term, in that sense of the term, that you'll take a look at maybe reading this book. But early on in the novel, the Ministry for the Future is established. And it's an eye chart. But what actually is the Ministry for the Future? It's effectively a global governing body, or a subsidiary body, built under Article 19, Clause 1 of the Paris Agreement, under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. In other words, the Paris Agreement, the one that our country signed, and then withdrew from, and then rejoined, and then I don't know for sure if we have formally withdrawn again, but my suspicion is that we will in the near future. Obviously, the Paris Agreement built the IPCC, which is the group of the United Nations that is structurally designed to advocate for the climate and to develop arrangements between and within countries to arrest climate change. But as written in the book, the Ministry for the Future was specifically established with the IPCC and all agencies of the United Nations and all of the governments signatory to the Paris Agreement to advocate for the world's future generations, whose rights, as defined by the Declaration of Human Rights, are valid as our own today. This new subsidiary body was furthermore charged with defending all living creatures, present and future, who cannot speak for themselves. So right from the beginning, some would say you see fantasy. I would say you see an actual realization that we're only here for a transitory period of time, and that we should remember that those that follow us have rights similar to our own. We shouldn't have to fight for them. So the ministry itself is built as its own governing body. In the book, you'll learn that it's based out of Zurich. How does the ministry come to be? How does it function? What does it work on? Who are its main characters? All of this is contained within those 500 and so pages. Okay, there are a couple of central characters. One, the story is seen through some of these central characters, including the woman who is charged to be the first minister or the director of the Ministry for the Future. Another major character in the book is a victim of a climate disaster. One of the few, perhaps the only survivor of a killing heat wave in India that killed over 20 million people, which is how the book opens. First thing I learned from that book, through that opening, was that if the temperature outside is sustained at wet bulb temperature, when you factor in humidity, is sustained above 35 degrees Celsius, you basically poach yourself. and you will die. And since reading that book, we've actually encountered heat waves of short duration that exceed 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature. So, anyways, so the ministry was formed to work on advocating for the people who aren't here yet, because it's going to be their climate too. I wonder if anybody thinks about the Iroquois. If I ever get a chance to ask Mr. Robinson himself, I would ask him, do you know about it? Have you ever studied the Iroquois Confederacy and their thinking about how they make decisions, which they call the 7 generations model? The decision made today has to include some concept or some thinking about how that decision today, whatever the decision is, will affect for 7 generations beyond today, which is a pretty long time when you think about it. This country is only about 8 or 9, 10 generations old. So, an interesting thought. Anyways, so that's what the ministry is. Why did I read this book? Number one, I pretty much read every Kim Stanley Robinson book I can find. I first read Mars, and the Mars trilogy came out in the early to mid-90s. It was a very interesting book. Again, a fairly near-term future. I sometimes wonder if our Mr. Musk also read it and got his inspiration. But the Mars trilogy was an interesting set of books. But next to the Ministry for the Future, I thought The Years of Rice and Salt, which was an imagination of global history without Europe, was really good. It's a really interesting book. The premise of The Years of Rice and Salt is that, yeah, Europe did die during the Black Plague. It was 95% death rate instead of 5 or 12% death rate. What happens to the world afterwards? Very good book. And then, of course, Science and the Capital Trilogy, which was also put together as one book called The Green Earth a little bit later. These 3 books came out in the early 2000s, focused on Washington, D.C., going through sudden and dramatic climate change. Seemed a little fanciful until you watched the snowstorm in the past couple of weeks down there. You can imagine 50 degrees below, 50 days of constant snow, which is the premise of the second book. But anyways, so Robinson has been thinking about near-term and climate for a long time. The other reason I read this book is because I read, when they came out, 2312 and New York 2140. Again, science fiction's within the near term, with less than 500 years from today. 2312 came out first, New York 2140 came out later, and the Ministry for the Future, although Robinson wouldn't necessarily say it, to me is the first of that trilogy of books, but written in the backwards. Because what happens in 2312 alludes to things that happened in New York 2140, which alludes to what happens in this book. Some of the phrases. Again, I'm not 100% sure that Mr. Robinson designed it that way, but certainly as a reader of all 3, you can see some of the themes continue to pass on backwards. And I always wondered, how did they come up with that? The Ministry for the Future helped come up with that. So that's why I read it. Themes and thoughts. I had a lot of themes and thoughts. And when I was thinking, how am I going to fit all this into 45 minutes? I really can't. I could talk about one or go into deep detail, but knowing that most of you haven't actually read the book, I think it's probably better to just talk about the various themes that I mentioned early on and some of the thoughts that come out in this book. A major element of Robinson's book is the social economy. Money, banking, insurance. I'll try not to spoil it, Liz, but bankers rule everything. And if you can convince the bankers that it's in their best interest to do some stuff, guess what? It's going to happen. And what's interesting, are there real levers to force change? Yes. What happens when it becomes uneconomical to insure your losses? If you own a second home down in Florida, or you're a resident in California right now, you're already living this. Remember, he wrote this 5 years ago. Nobody talked about reinsurers or loss of property insurance or property value in the face of an inability to insure because of climate change. Are there alternative forms of fiat money? When this was written in 2020, some of the concepts around blockchain money, which is like an open public accounting book for money. All transactions are recorded and encrypted and stuff like that, known now as cryptocurrency, were first coming out. In some subsequent interviews, Robinson has said, I wouldn't have talked as much about blockchain and cryptocurrency knowing what I know now. But he does still say that fiat understanding, a good understanding of fiat money, what really makes money, and what it means to have money is an important part of this entire problem that we face. The future value of money, as understood by economists, is an essential element of tackling climate change. And quite frankly, economists so steeply discount the future that it's not worth it to them to invest. And that's a regulatory issue. That's a law issue, as much as it is a societal issue. There's a long discussion about that in the book. Geoengineering, another topic. I've heard Robinson say in other speeches that I don't know why humans get so squeamish about geoengineering, because we have been geoengineering the planet for a long time. In the past 200 years, since we started burning fossil fuels at great quantity, we're actually geoengineering the world right around us right now. We're just not doing it in a controlled manner or scientific manner, we're just doing it. So to what extent is geoengineering, can it slow climate change? Should it be adopted? Who decides? Who gets to decide? It's part of what the Paris Agreement was all about, and what the Ministry for the Future spends a lot of its time dealing with. What methods might exist? How can they be measured? Very important point. How can they be incentivized? Again, without spoiling the book, one of the key innovations that the Ministry for the Future adopts globally is a way to incentivize the non-burning of carbon or the capture of carbon down to the lowest possible level, meaning the poorest people can earn a living by sequestering carbon. And that generates a whole economy around it. Very interesting idea. Something that we've been trying in our state and in our nation for a while, but just can't quite figure it out. Part of the reason it goes back to number one, which is that bankers so steeply discount the future that it's not worth it to. Eco-defense or eco-terrorism. Again, some of the things that happen in the novel happen outside the control, perhaps, of the Ministry for the Future, and they're labeled eco-terrorists. But the actions that are taken also change the behavior of people to be more respectful of the environment. The children of Cali, they feature in the book. They're a terrorist group, or they're a defender group, depending on how you look at it. I argue that they're a group radicalized by the fact that 20 million people were killed in their country and they have no control over why that happened. So they're going to exert some effort to make people pay. Yes, ma'am?
Sentence, actors radicalized by climate disaster justified in killing others, makes me think about engineering.
Yes. Yes, imagine that.
It's a parallel.
Yes.
Because most people, at least, I shouldn't say that.
Some people believe he was
killing as a killing.
Yes.
Other people are like, yeah, he's spending his money for his defense.
Yes, I don't know how many people, and I'm sorry to spoil this little plot element, I don't know how many people worldwide would appreciate Crash Day when the hundreds or thousands of jet-powered airliners are crashed simultaneously. But people stop flying in airplanes. Green technology and adaptation, another big theme, obviously. What new technologies or old technologies could be repurposed in the quest to stop burning fossil fuels? What role does the government play in accelerating or decelerating adoption of climate resilience. These are big themes in the novel. Again, I go back to the bankers rule the world, but they're not the only actors. They're the ones that actually have maybe their hands on a real lever. But how do you convince a nation that whose resource is fossil fuel to stop pumping it? It's their capital asset. How do you do that? Trauma and recovery. I mentioned a survivor, perhaps the sole survivor of a catastrophic human mass death event. Obviously, a PTSD survivor. So seeing how the world is seen through his eyes and how he tries to navigate the world after surviving what was pretty much an unsurvivable condition is a really interesting element of the book. He's a very important character, but it's not just one person that I think the author is trying to talk about. He's also talking about our cultures. Our entire civilization is in the throes of a big trauma. And we may not want to recognize it today, but maybe someday we'll recognize that a lot of what's happening to us is traumatizing, and we're trying to deal with that around us right now. Okay? Amazing that he wrote this book 5 years later. I'm like, wow. So how do you recover from a life-altering trauma without help? This is what this particular victim tries for a long time. And it doesn't work too well for him. And amazingly enough, the help comes from one primary source of help comes from one of the other major characters, and then from a character that's not really named, but it's called nature, and just being in nature. Conservation and rewilding. Some interesting things that are real life that actually exist right now are mentioned in the book and become somewhat plot elements. The 2,000 watt society exists. It's a group of people who are committed to living their life on 2,000 watts per day. That's it. So I'm pretty much sure that I use 2,000 watts of electricity before I even drink my first cup of coffee in the morning. Why 2,000 watts? It's based on how much energy the sun delivers to the planet on a daily basis divided by the population. In other words, to build and live in a 2,000 watt life is a dramatic change to a lifestyle. So another project that comes up is the Half Earth program, or the Half Earth project. It's a rewilding project that connects corridors of marginal or disused land around the globe so that wildlife can freely transit from place to place. One of those, now you have to deal with me without the slides, sorry. So we actually have some of those corridors building even in our own local area when you think about it. Finger Lakes Land Trust and conservation associations and easements seek to collect territory, local territory, and keep them wild or permanently wild. Tom Richmond is the leader. I see some Richmond folks here, much to the chagrin of some of their officials, but conservation and rewilding in the discussions or that theme also is a bit of a marvel of how much can our earth heal itself once we stop trying to damage it. So my next slide here, sorry you can't see it, is things I enjoyed about the book. So probably, I'll just read the slide. There's a lot of climate tragedies. There's a lot of individual losses, obviously. There's a tremendous amount of political upheaval. But when I got done to the end of the book, I was uplifted. It was amazing. You read a book about near extinction, so to speak, and you walk away going, wow, I'm actually optimistic for a future for my kids and their kids. I can see it happening. It's a future you can imagine, and one that I have been affected by and for to advocate. For instance, I believe that we do need the futures advocate involved in our decision making. We hear a lot of happy talk many times from our leaders, elected and appointed, about we're doing this for the future, but who actually represents your grandkids that aren't born yet? Ideally, it's the people we elect. or the leaders of business or whatever. But for the most part, they only care about next quarter. So having a futures advocate in today's decision making is something that I will continue to advocate for. Another, let's see, you got it? Is, oh, everybody can see all my secret files here. That's all right. There's a lot on this disk. I'm in trouble if I ever lose it. All right. Yes, should be good. There we go. All right, almost there, folks. There we go. Okay, so that's the slide I'm on. I think my favorite chapter in the whole book is chapter 76. I won't spoil too much other than to say it was written from the perspective of someone who's in the Navy. Being formerly in the Navy, I can appreciate that. But most importantly, it was a bit of an extended discussion on life adequacy as a measure of happiness and wealth. In other words, what is adequate for living? Right? What is really adequate? And should we put limits on how much someone has above that level of adequacy when there are so many who don't have even the least adequate existence? It's a huge problem. It's obviously it's a discussion on inequality in our world, both maybe even within our own communities, but certainly globally. And how much is enough? Chapter 76, I recommend it. Pricing in the social costs of fossil fuel. It's its own discussion in chapter 69. Obviously, we do not price the social costs of burning fossil fuels today. This has been a real struggle to, one, even define them. Maybe one could argue we didn't really know all the social costs for burning fossil fuels into our atmosphere. But now that we do know of many of them, and obviously climate degradation is one of the biggest, we should try to price that in. Again, I come back to the social economy theme and who really controls a lot of stuff in the world, and how do economists and bankers look at the world? Because if they can't see the social costs and they can't figure out how to price carbon properly, then you're never going to be able to price it in. And then many people have heard me describe myself as one of the most strongest advocates for deeply socialistic views based on my experiences in life. Public ownership of necessities provided as human rights and public goods. This is what governments are designed to do. So if you're a libertarian, I'm sorry, I think you're going to find the leopards don't care. But governments really need to be the arbiters, so to speak, of these public goods, these human rights. And a big part of the struggle in the book is trying to come to that globally, because there are systems already in existence within our world that definitely come from that role, and then there are others who are definitely opposed to it. It ties into life adequacy as well. Other things I enjoyed in this, I'm going to just give you some quotes that I took out of the book. You can read them. You'll find them eventually. The real premise, the whole plot line is talking about the trembling 20s and the 30s and the 40s. It's about a 30-year span, maybe 40-year span in the time of the book, which actually starts in 2025. The book was written in 2019, published in 2020. Had things been different in this past year, I think that we'd actually be on the road to having a ministry for the future, so to speak. But I do think currently we're in that global trauma of recognizing what seems to be an insoluble problem of climate change and living within a big extinction event, and we don't know what to do. Unfortunately, we don't have a ministry. We are in the trembling 20s. The 30s were zombie years, meaning the 2030s. Civilization was already dead, but it didn't know it. And by that, the civilization that was dependent on fossil fuels. It's dead. This is something that, in the last few weeks, that particular line keeps coming back to me based on what's been going on. Until the climate was actually killing them, people had a tendency to deny it could happen. I think we see that every time a hurricane roars through Florida, or a tornado tears up New York. Graha Satya, interesting excursion, related to the children of Cali, so to speak, and one of the other major characters in the book, who is the deputy director of the Ministry for the Future. But it's a made-up word, like it's a Sanskrit word that means force peace. And then probably my truly favorite quote of all time is about the deer. Because there is no truer statement than the deer are the sad sacks of the world, of the American wildlife. Anyways, so if you saw my commercial that Alexis made me film, I said this is the greatest science, one of the best fictions ever. These are the reasons why I consider it one of the best fictions I've ever read. You can read a lot of books and at the end of them, oh, the world is doomed. This one, you can read this book and go, the world has a chance. And I like that. Most importantly, you realize that when you understand that the book is really about the best of us. And so many novels are written about the worst of us, or the last of us. Obviously, the depth that it goes to in an interconnected world of human nature and society and biosphere is really important. Few fictions ever really get into that, and it gave me a much greater understanding of looking at the world through a complex web. The interludes that give voice to the voiceless. One of my favorite parts of the book, if you've read it, you know what I'm talking about. For those who are going to read it, short chapters. I think my favorite of the short chapters is the one on carbon. But various little interludes along the way. Yeah, I Am History is also one of the good ones. And then it's coherent, it's well written, it's lively. My wife would tell you, but she's usually asleep, that I stayed up sometimes almost the whole night continuing to read this book to get it done because I couldn't put it down.
That's true.
So obviously any book is one of the best books you ever read when you just can't stand to put it down. And then when you're all done with it, you're like, I'm ready to do it again, which I was. In fact, I read all those books again all over. So that's a little bit about the Ministry for the Future. I guess now it's time for your thoughts or questions. Yes, ma'am.
So my first comment, then a question. My comment is that when I read the description that Alexis written, it just was like so I feel very optimistic that you say it's optimistic. So that's my comment. And then my question is, has the author ever been approached to get involved in actual ecological climate control organizations? Because he seems very brilliant and full of ideas, and it's like, why are you writing a fiction book? Why don't you help the world?
Good question. And I summarize, is Kim Stanley Robinson involved in any of the efforts globally to work on climate change? The answer is yes. He's a frequent speaker to organizations like 350.org or Pioneers. I don't know that too many government have said, but I can imagine his role as an Imagineer within the government to help tell stories. Because that's part of our problem in dealing with complex government issue and the delivery of those public goods is it's hard to tell a story. And in this case, I think he's spoken to the UN, he's spoken to the IPCC, he's been guests at their meetings and stuff like that. So I do believe he is involved, but he's not running for office. He's never going to run for office. I think based on some of the stuff I've read about him in some of his interviews, he would argue that I'm good at telling the story, but I'm not a scientist who we should listen to. I'm not a lawyer who is brilliant enough to use the laws and adapt the laws and make new laws so that we can get this world. And I'm definitely not the politician. And I don't know. If he was like me, I would just to most of them and also the big rich people in the world because they're part of the big roadblocks. So I don't think he gets invited to Davos, which does have a nice chapter in it. It's really a fun chapter. I can't wait to see it happen in real life. So if it inspires a modern version of the children of Cali to persuade those who visit Davos every winter for their fun convention of the richest people in the world to talk about all the world's problems, but then actually go spend money on the people who will not solve them, I'm all for it. I don't advocate crash date, though. Good question. Yes, ma'am?
Is there one thing that us individuals could be doing to help
To help in which?
prevent the climate change? Just
I think the book talks about everything from the lowest person to these globe-spanning operations to work on addressing climate change and building resiliency. My personal opinion, you do what you can do, right? There are things that any of us could do. We could compost instead of sending our organic waste to the landfill. We could buy an electric car. We could do a lot of different things. At an individual level, you can advocate and try to support politicians or elected officials and guide them make the right decisions instead of just a decision based on the most powerful, right? To talk about your grandkids and their kids, because they're the ones who inherit the earth. The one thing I did note when I finished this book is, let's see, in this timeline, AJ will be pretty old when we get to the end. If he makes it to the end of this timeline, I hope this is the timeline that I get to the end of, right? For my kids who are in their 20s, they're in the middle of their life at the end of this timeline, right? And for their kids who aren't even born, they're going to show up at the very end. They're just going to come into a world at the end of the timeline of this book, okay? And depending on how it goes, you might still end up with the world of New York 2140, which is a great book, I might add, especially if you like New York City. Imagine it's New York City a century after this. Oh, by the way, it's flooded. It's flooded all the way up to 52nd Street, right? Some of the buildings have been repurposed, subways, new technologies being used. You learn about airships in this book. Sorry, Liz. And then, but in New York 2140, you see how they've been integrated into the global world. Yeah, my great-grandkids might live in New York 2140. I hope it's a world worth living in. Yes, ma'am?
How did the capitalists get convinced that this Center for the Future?
So, since most of the people didn't read the book yet, I leave it to you to read the book, but this incident at Davos, that's one way, okay? Also, trying to convince the economists to change the way they think about the future and price in these costs or the anticipated losses in the future if things continue the way they do. For instance, part of the Ministry for the Future's mission is to track how much carbon, what the ppm for carbon is they're like the IPCC, there's a scorecard in it, and they're trying to reverse that ever upward trajectory. I mentioned the 350.org organization. A little while ago, you may have heard of Bill McKibben. He was one of the principal architects of 350.org. And where did 350 come from? About 20 years ago, they're like 350 parts per million carbon dioxide in the air is a limit. We don't want to break that limit. Because at that point, our biosphere becomes unstable enough that we can't predict how it's going to end. I hate to tell you folks, but we're over that by quite a bit. And in fact, in the years since 350.org started, there's been more and more carbon dioxide put into the air every year. Even though the Paris Agreement and other agreements, both multilateral, bilateral, and global, all say we should stop. Okay? Raise your hand if you've heard of the Climate Leadership Protection Act, the CLCPA. I forget what the third C is. The New York State law was passed in 2019. All right, Climate Leadership Protection Act. Community Protection Act, CLCPA. The CLCPA was passed in 2019 by the New York legislature, signed by then Governor Cuomo. It is the law of New York. It sets goals that require New York State to generate less fossil fuel emissions by 2030 and by 2040. And one of the biggest parts of that law is that New York State, they call them GHGs or greenhouse gases, that we will cut 50% of our GHG output by 2030. All right, what creates GHGs? Utilities create GHGs, right? Cars create GHGs, farming creates GHGs, landfills create GHGs, industry creates GHGs, consumer products and packaging all create greenhouse gases, GHGs, primarily carbon dioxide, methane, carbon monoxide. So the state is on record, it has a law that says we have to cut these by 50%, and it's 2025. Yet every year, you will hear loud voices saying, we can't electrify all of our school buses, the technology's not there yet. Why do you think we're trying to electrify our school buses? Because those diesel engines drive around our county roads every day, emitting GHGs. If we could power them by a battery, then we would reduce that 25% of GHG generation that's related to transportation and vehicle miles traveled. Could you do it? You could buy an EV, you would contribute a little bit to that. Okay, that's one of the reasons why you're starting to see some of these technologies deploying within New York State. Unfortunately, it's not easy. So this is a state function trying to force an economic change because maybe the economists haven't quite priced in the value of our future yet. I don't know. It's interesting. Yes, ma'am?
Okay, again, I have a comment, then a question.
Okay.
My comment on what you can do is eat vegan at least once a week, okay? Because animals generate a lot of problems, and my question is, do they talk about that?
Yes, they do.
So if you're asking,
Let me just
what
say
can
that
you
the
do
children in
about
Cali,
this?
they're involved in promoting veganism.
Yes.
I won't tell you how because I want you to read the book.
The amount of methane and bad stuff that's produced by the farming industry, the water they use, it's just, it goes on and on. And so if you really care about the environment, you go eat this at least once a week, preferably 7 days a week.
Yes, sir.
I was going to say, the Project Drawdown, that has a lot of good information on prioritizing different initiatives. So if you're looking to get involved somewhere, that would be it.
So you can just Google Project Drawdown and find them? Okay. Good comment. All right. I did that in 46 minutes? Wow, that's pretty impressive. Thank you all for coming. There are many copies in OWL, so if you don't want to